New tonight, a wrongful death lawsuit filed today accuses police in Stamford of using excessive force on a mentally ill man back in 2019. Officers are accused of dragging that man down a hill in the rain and laughing as he was lying unresponsive on the floor of a holding room of the Stamford Police Department. He was later pronounced dead at the hospital. That man's mother spoke today as the lawsuit was filed.
This mistreatment of mentally ill patient by the police has to stop.
23-year-old Stephen Barrier, who was mentally ill, was taken into police custody on October 23rd of 2019.
No, he's psychotic.
Oh, okay.
Yes, because he's like a diagnosed schizophrenic.
Body cam footage of that night shows Stamford police officers unable to get Stephen to stand during his arrest, then dragging him down a hill. Multiple officers carrying Barrier to one of their cruisers to bring him back to the police department. During the ride, officers say that Barrier asked if the air conditioning could be turned on. When they got to the police department, they found him unconscious.
My son did not have to die. He was having a mental health crisis, and instead of being treated by doctors and therapists, he was surrounded by the police. I told them that my son needed urgent psychiatric help, but the police handcuffed my son and dragged him down a steep hill in the pouring rain.
The lawsuit filed by his mother and the Connecticut Legal Rights Project accuses Stamford police of excessive force and failing to immediately get Stephen emergency medical care after he was taken into custody. His mother said that since police knew of his mental illness, they should have taken him to the hospital and not to the police department. Body cam video also shows the moments when officers surrounded Stephen unresponsive on the floor of a holding room.
He's unresponsive. We don't know if he's fit.
You got a bolt?
Check his foot, see if he has a reaction.
No, you just get a bottom of a pen cap.
That's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah, pen cap.
just start, like roll it, do it over.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. Just
Or
make a pen.
credit card under the nose.
Oh yeah, that's another good one.
That'll make them jump.
He was put into the back of a police car and died on the floor and in jail, surrounded by people who are untrained and caring. They laughed and they mocked while he died in front of them. Clearly, you can see that there was no respect for Stephen's life.
Barrier was eventually brought to the hospital where he was then pronounced dead.
The state attorney, Richard Colangelo, issued a statement stating that there was no evidence that there was no use of force in taking Stephen into custody. And his death was a simple result of natural causes. If this young, healthy 23-year-old was going to die of natural cause, why didn't he die at home?
According to the medical examiner, an autopsy found no evidence of any inflicted injuries. And Stephen's mother in that virtual hearing today said that she's filing this lawsuit against Stamford police to push for more of a focus on mental illness and so that other families don't have to endure the loss that she's feeling. Stamford police telling Fox 61 that they don't comment on pending litigation.